In this episode, we talk about opposition politicians and journalists claiming to have received a threat notification on their iPhone. We also talk about Telangana's gig workers who have raised certain demands from political parties ahead of the election. But first, we talk about the Electoral Bond scheme. Hi, I'm Rahel Philipose, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. On Tuesday, a 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court began hearing a batch of petitions challenging the constitutional validity of the Finance Ministry's Electoral Bond scheme of 2018. The scheme was initially proposed by the late Arun Jaitley in 2017 when he was serving as the Finance Minister. The scheme essentially allows individuals to make anonymous donations to their preferred political parties and has raised concerns among political watchdogs. In fact, even the Reserve Bank of India and the Election Commission have voiced concerns about the scheme. And last year, 2 NGOs, Common Cause and the Association for Democratic Reforms, filed petitions challenging the scheme, which the Supreme Court took up on Tuesday. To know more about the rationale behind electoral bonds and why they are facing a legal challenge, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Apurva Vishwanath in this segment.
Apurva, electoral bonds essentially allow Indian citizens or Indian companies to anonymously make donations to political parties. Before we go ahead, is there anything else listeners should know about them?
Yeah, so this is essentially what the 2018 electoral bond scheme is. The government brought in saying that this is going to clean up political funding of elections in the country. And it basically enables anonymous donations to political parties. And I think from 2018, we've at least, in the first tranche of donations between then and now, there's been around 13,000 crores that has been donated to political parties through electoral bonds. This has now become the single biggest mode of donating to political parties in India.
Right, and what might strike some people as odd is that you can donate money to political parties through this anonymously, and yet it was brought in to bring about transparency.
The government's argument for this is, Shashank, that earlier a lot of donations were made in cash, and individual donations which were less than 20,000 rupees, which were made in cash, need not have been disclosed to the Election Commission. So the argument was that a lot of parties would say we've got donations in cash and they're all small donations. Say, somebody's donated 10,000 rupees, somebody's donated 5,000 rupees. So this petty amount we don't need to disclose. And the government argues that this was the biggest mode of funding elections in the country. And that is, a route to have black money enter the system for elections. So in order to eliminate that, the government says they've introduced electoral bonds. So now that route, which was 20,000 and less, which used to go in cash, the government's argument, and this is something that even Solicitor General Tushar Mehta is going to argue in court this week, is that petty cash donation, which was essentially black money, is now coming through banking channels, through the State Bank of India, where KYC formalities have happened for the parties. So this is how election funding is being cleaned up.
So it's not so much about transparency as far as finding out how political parties are funded, as much as it's about ensuring that black money is not used and that political parties basically get money through banking channels.
Yeah, but not in cash, but actually through electoral bonds. So this is one of the issues where there was some back and forth between the Reserve Bank of India and the government as well. The Reserve Bank of India expressed apprehensions that the electoral bond would be a bearer instrument, which means, the holder of the instrument essentially has ownership. So it doesn't matter where the money came from. Whoever holds that bond, it belongs to him. So say like, how you get a DD in a bank. So this is something that the RBI said would probably not be good for accountability. But the government's argument has been this is essential feature of the electoral bond scheme because it protects the donor. It creates an anonymity for the donor, and then the donor can pass it on to political parties without any fear of repercussions. So say you're donating to party X and the idea is party Y might not like you because they are in power and they think you're not donating to them. So the government argues that this choice that a donor makes to remain anonymous and express her political affiliation, that is very important and key to this electoral bond structure.
Right. And in that regard, the Attorney General arguing in this case has said that revealing the identity of those making the donations will be violating a citizen's right to privacy.
Yeah, so, the government's argument is that there are two competing rights here. One is the citizen's right to know, which is again something that flows from the right to freedom of speech and expression in the Constitution. On the other hand, there is the donor's right to freely express his political affiliations and remain anonymous, which is, here the government says this is something that the Supreme Court has enshrined in the landmark privacy ruling in 2017. So the Puttaswamy judgment says that political affiliation is something that is in the core zone of privacy. So it is a stretched argument, but the government says these two rights have to be balanced. And the electoral bond scheme is, in a way, a balance of both these rights.
Okay, so far we have talked about the government's argument in this case, but talk about on what basis has the constitutional validity of electoral bonds been challenged?
So there are three essential issues when it comes to the challenge for electoral bonds. First is, of course, a challenge to the electoral bond scheme itself. This veil of anonymity, whether that is constitutional, whether political parties need not disclose who they receive money from. Because the argument that the government makes is this is something that even the political parties may not necessarily know, right? Where they're getting that money from. So that is more in the nature of the sanctity of elections and how campaign finance laws should be in the country. That is the first step of the challenge. The second is, whether political parties should be brought within the purview of Right to Information Act. And here the Supreme Court has said they must, and each political party must appoint an information officer and things like that. So that is the other important aspect.
And Apurva, in that sense, are political parties being treated as private companies, which obviously also don't come under the purview of this act?
So political parties, they're not essentially state, but they're not entirely private parties as well. A number of legislations regulate political parties, from the Representations of People's Act, the Moral Code of Conduct, other election laws and rules all apply to political parties. And if they don't follow any of these, they're de-recognized by the Election Commission. So in that context, the idea of on matters relating to finance and administration, not on political strategy or not on their inner workings, but just on finance and administration, the argument that is frequently made is that political parties must be considered public offices for that purpose.
Okay, and now talk about the third reason why electoral bonds have been challenged.
So the third is, of course, the challenge to the amendments because they were brought in through the Finance Act. So that is a larger challenge about whether you can use the money bill route to introduce key legislation like this. Now, our listeners would know that, we've discussed this before, that there's a larger constitution bench of 7 judges that is supposed to hear that issue separately. Because the money bill aspect is not just unique to electoral bonds. We've seen that, say, in the case of Aadhaar or PMLA amendments. A lot of these legislations have been introduced through the money bill route, where essentially the Rajya Sabha has no say in the passing of this legislation. The Lok Sabha passes it and it's along with the union budget and it's sort of done. So that's something that the court has to separately look at. So these are 3 broad issues where the court will have to now give a considered opinion on. The money bill issue might not be heard right now because a larger bench is pending. So that might be something that a larger bench will decide. But on the first 2 aspects, the challenge to the scheme itself and the bringing political parties within the purview of RTI, these are 2 issues that the court will have to now hear.
And has the Supreme Court said anything about electoral bonds in the past?
So this case was one of those very important cases that was put in sort of cold storage. The court wasn't hearing this issue urgently. The challenge came about like 5 years ago. So the court hasn't said anything on the legality of electoral bonds. There's been no prima facie view as such. But about cleaning up of elections, right? That is something that has been a Supreme Court-led project, to put it that way. You've seen a lot of these rulings which brought in key changes in how elections are conducted, how procedural safeguards are introduced to keep elections free and fair. They have been projects that have been driven by the Supreme Court in public interest litigations. Say, for example, disclosure of assets, disclosure of criminal charges by those contesting elections. All of these things have been issues that have been mooted through the Supreme Court. A PIL petitioner would come and talk about these, and then the Supreme Court would ask the Election Commission on what is the best way to go about this. And the Supreme Court has in a way, taken the lead on these issues. So we do have a long history of jurisprudence where the Supreme Court takes an active role on election issues. So a number of those judgments of the court itself talk about the citizen's right to know. So that is something that the court will now have to essentially determine. How far can you take that right to know, and whether the electoral bond scheme impinges on that right to know.
And next, we talk about opposition leaders and their iPhones. Earlier this week, several opposition politicians and journalists claimed that they had received a threat notification from Apple saying that iPhones were being targeted by state-sponsored attackers. Among the opposition leaders that received the threat were the Congress's Shashi Tharoor, AAP's Raghav Chadha, TMC's Mahua Moitra, and Shiv Sena's Priyanka Chaturvedi. Journalist Siddharth Vadrajan of The Wire and Observer Research Foundation President Samir Saran also received the notification. As expected, the Apple alert led to a political firestorm, with the opposition pointing fingers at the center and drawing parallels with the earlier Pegasus spyware controversy.
When our number one and number two were in charge in Gujarat, they have a history of what I call this kind of peeping Tom behavior. Now that they've come to Delhi, they can't get rid of it. So in 2021, if you remember, there was this Pegasus spyware which they bought from Israel and it went to court and nothing came of it. And this is the second time that obviously 24 is coming up and they want to distract from the main issues. So all the opposition, all of us in the opposition, we've named all the leaders. We've all received messages from Apple saying that state-sponsored attackers, what the state-sponsors attackers, which are very well funded and very sophisticated, are trying to get into our mobile devices and our sort of emails. So,
But the center, however, denied any involvement in the matter. During a press conference, Information Technology Minister Ashwini Vaishnav said the government was launching an investigation. He also claimed that the controversy was an attempt to distract from all the developmental work being carried out by PM Modi.
तो साथियों, जो लोग देश की प्रगति को पचा नहीं पा रहे, जो लोग देश को ऊपर बढ़ते हुए देख नहीं सकते, वो लोग डिस्ट्रैक्शन पॉलिटिक्स कर रहे हैं और केवल उनके मन में इतना है कि जिस तरह से भारत प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी के नेतृत्व में विश्व में अपना नाम आगे कमा रहा है, उसको वो डिस्ट्रैक्ट करे और उससे लोगों का ध्यान भटकाए.
And amid the controversy, Apple also weighed in. Soon after the allegations began to surface, the tech company issued a one-line statement.
Apple does not attribute the threat notification to any specific state-sponsored attacker.
That's the Indian Express's new media editor Nandagopal Rajan. Here he breaks down what Apple's statement really means.
So along with that one-line response, Apple also sort of gave the context from the product page it has for these threat notifications. It said state-sponsored attackers are very well funded and sophisticated and their attacks evolve over time. Detecting such attacks relies on threat intelligence signals that are often imperfect and incomplete. It is possible that some Apple threat notifications may be false alarms or that some attacks are not detected. So let's look at it. What does it say? It says that it is looking at some signals which is triggering this kind of a notification. It also is saying that some of these could be false alarms. It is also saying that it does not ensure that all the attacks are detected. Why is that? Because these attacks or the kind of malware used evolve over time, and it is possible that Apple doesn't know about a new malware out there.
The tech company said it cannot provide information about what leads to such threat notifications being issued, as it could help state-sponsored attackers adapt their behavior to evade detection in the future. Nandagopal joins us in this segment to talk about the Apple threat alert and its implications. So Nandu, we know that several political leaders and journalists received these threat notifications from Apple. Is this a one-off? How unusual is it for Apple to send out warnings like this?
Yes, it is unusual, but this is not new. After the Pegasus attack in, I think, August of 2021, Apple set up this system where if a similar kind of an activity was noted on an iPhone, it would send an alert or a threat notification to the user saying that, hey, your phone could be compromised.
Right. And Nandu, what sort of systems do tech companies like Apple have in place to counter potential malware attacks like these?
So again, this kind of malware attack is very rare. So what it does is that in this situation, so if somebody has got an alert for a state-sponsored attacker and being active on your phone, they are also being told that maybe you should put your phone into a lockdown mode. In the lockdown mode, obviously a lot of the features are not available, but it also means that it is difficult for an attacker to infiltrate the phone or take away any data from the phone. Along with that, it also gives you a lot of very standard kind of responses that you should have two-factor authentication, you should have a better password, and you should not click on links, all of that. And this maybe applies for all kinds of attacks.
Right. And there have been parallels that have been drawn between, this particular incident and the Pegasus attack. Can you talk about what this Pegasus spyware was and how it worked?
So the Pegasus spyware was developed by an Israeli company. It was being apparently used by some governments or government actors or state-sponsored actors, and a security lab, which is a standalone outfit, sort of found that this kind of attacks were happening, and it informed the world that a lot of people could have been impacted. It was about 6,000 people across the world, which included journalists, a lot of people in government posts, political leaders and all of that. And Pegasus was basically using what is called a zero-click vulnerability. So regular phishing attacks work when somebody is phishing for your click, right? So it sends you a mail or a link or a message where if you tap, it takes you to a place where your data gets compromised. But in this case, even that was not needed. It was using the zero-click vulnerability, which is basically that, anything that is being sent to you or any content that's been accessed on your phone is actually downloaded to your phone even before a security scan is done on it, right? So it basically uses that vulnerability to say that even before a security scan alerts the user that something could be wrong here, it has already infiltrated the phone. And that was something which was new, and a lot of your anti-malware protection, which is basically based on the regular way of phishing, could not detect this, and it could not be detected. And this security notification which Apple is now sending out is actually a response to that, because Apple realized that its phones, which are supposed to be more secure than the Android phones, after BlackBerry went out of the picture and used by a lot of people in power, suddenly you have an Achilles heel on it. So, you had to fix it, and which is where it became very active in this space.
Right. And it's not regular people getting these alerts, right? It's almost always people with some amount of power or some sort of influence.
So again, this is very expensive software. If somebody is going to spend that kind of money to get something out of your phone, you have to be an important person, or you need to be somebody with access to a lot of important information, right? So regular people are unlikely to get this kind of a thing. This is usually targeted at people in power. So even if you see people in power or people of importance, and if you see the list of people who have claimed that they have been attacked this time, again, most of them are in that space.
Right. So that's, one big similarity between these two incidents. Are there other parallels to be drawn here?
So in common is the fact that a software which is generally not available or sold to individuals or private companies has been used. That is the commonality, right? Pegasus was something like that. And based on that, Apple is saying here that this is also kind of malware which is otherwise not available. So it's available only to state-sponsored actors. So, that is the commonality. It doesn't have to be Pegasus. It can be something similar, or it can be something which is mimicking the kind of patterns which tells you this is a malware that is usually used by a state-funded actor.
Right. And the security implications of something like this are evidently pretty huge. And with an election right around the corner, an incident like this is particularly alarming, right? Can you talk about the sort of concerns that this raises?
So the first concern is that even the iPhone, which is supposed to be very secure, the good thing here is that it can at least tell you have been attacked, right? And in most cases, most of the phones you wouldn't even know, because the attacks have become so sophisticated that you will not know what is happening. And here it's but even then there are maybe new vulnerabilities which can be tapped on your phone, or vulnerabilities that Apple doesn't know of or anybody doesn't know of. And there are obviously these kind of vulnerabilities in any device. These are called zero-day vulnerabilities, and you discover it only after you have been attacked. So these kind of vulnerabilities are out there. So you're not in a fully secure world. And the fact that there are people looking, at your device if you're an important person trying to get your data. So basically they can know everything that you're doing on the phone. And the phone, being the most personal computing device, now has access to so much data about you and whatever you do.
So what then, according to you, is, the safest way to use a phone?
So basically, the more you use your phone, the more vulnerable you become. The more you browse, the more you use an app, the more apps you download, the more links you click. Everything is a vulnerability, technically. So a security expert I've spoken to over the years keeps saying that he doesn't keep any app on his phone. So if he has to use Facebook, if he has to use Twitter, he will just log into twitter.com on the browser and access it and then log out immediately. So a lot of these apps, what happens with an app is that an app takes 10 permissions when it actually has to do only 2. Now, these extra 8 permissions are taken thinking that maybe 3 years down the line, I'm going to have an update which is going to use this one of these features, right? But it's not going to use it. It's basically like a small backdoor entry for, somebody. So it might be tough to infiltrate the iOS operating system, but it might be a little bit easier to infiltrate an app. So what Apple does, for instance, compared to an Android, is that anything that is going on the Apple Store is still verified by Apple and whatever. But even there, like if it's a vulnerability that is not known, you don't know what to look for. So when you're in a security person is scanning a new app that is going to be listed on the store, he doesn't even know that there is a vulnerability he should be looking for. And that is the kind of vulnerability that is exploited by it. So see, the safest way to use a phone is technically not to use it, right? And again, that is not an option for any of us anymore, right? Which means that you have to bring in a little bit of safe browsing, safe usage behavior into your thing, which means that if you get a message from a number, an international number, for instance, which has nothing to do with you, it's better not to respond and better to block it immediately on WhatsApp especially. So these kind of things, you just need to be a little bit safe. And if any offer sounds to be too good to be true, it is fake.
And in the end, we talk about gig workers in Telangana. The Telangana Gig and Platform Workers Union, or the TGPWU, was established in 2021 and has been actively advocating for the rights of workers in the unorganized sector, including food delivery executives, cab drivers, and home service providers in the state. For instance, earlier this year, the union ran a campaign in Hyderabad, during which approximately 5,000 drivers associated with various cab aggregators like Ola and Uber decided to refuse trips to the airport in a bid to exert pressure on the ride-hailing apps to increase fares. And now, with elections just around the corner, the union has come up with a list of pro-worker demands for all the contesting parties. To know more about these demands and how the parties have reacted to them, my colleague Utsa Sarmin speaks to the Indian Express's Rahul V Pisharody in this segment.
Rahul, begin by telling us about gig workers in Telangana. How strong is that demographic?
So there are about 4.2 lakh gig and platform workers in Telangana is what we are told. Majority of them stay and live in the state capital, Hyderabad itself. However, this number is not a definitive figure. This is shared by the union leaders. There is no government number available on this. Talking about the demography, a majority of them are youngsters, students and school dropouts. You see them every day, outside. They work around 12 to 18 hours a day, working with different platforms, earning about 20 to 25,000 rupees a month. But what they tell us is that there is no job security or even guarantee for their life at the end of the day. They're forced to do this because they don't find any regular jobs, or sometimes they choose to do this as a part-time option, which is also why they are demanding better working conditions or better pay and other social security benefits. Because at the present, it is an unorganized sector and there is hardly any regulations that bind them.
And could you tell us about the Telangana Gig and Platform Workers Union and what kind of issues they have highlighted?
So this Telangana Gig and Platform Workers Union is basically an organization which aims to help workers realize the benefits granted to them under Code on Social Security Rules 2020, released by Government of India in December 2020. And this, they say, has not been implemented on ground even after 3 years. And the fight continues to ensure that the workers are given what they are entitled to, which is basically life and disability cover, health and maternity benefits, old age pension, education benefits, provident fund, and things like that. So these are guaranteed in this Code on Security, Social Security, and the fight continues. And we have seen the union leaders fight on different aspects, from wage thefts to illegal terminations and unfair working hours, safety and security of workers. And whenever there is an incident of workers' death or accident or anything of that sort, we see them come out. They have been regularly staging protests for cab drivers' welfare, for instance. And we see them regularly submitting representations to government officials raising these issues. And they are also widely connected with organizations in other states. They are also present in different cities and states. And it is a very active union.
So considering the upcoming elections, what is the union demanding from different political parties?
So with elections around the corner, this is right time for them to flag these issues. And as a strategy, they have approached different political parties. They claim that we are a strong force of 4.2 lakh youngsters, and we can be an influential and impactful group on the ground to influence the election and the vote bank. They have four specific demands. These demands are based on what the Rajasthan government and what the Karnataka government have been able to implement on ground. These are the two governments which have so far done something on this regard. The 4 points include setting up of a social security board for gig and platform workers. They want welfare fee on each transaction generator on the platform, so that this amount can be collected and deposited in a social security fund, which will be dedicated for funding their social security schemes for the workers' welfare, so that at the end of the day, they don't have to seek any fund or any assistance, financial assistance from the government. That is one. They want a tripartite board with representation of aggregators, workers' organizations, and the government, to notify and administer social security schemes for the welfare of persons working in the gig and platform economy. That is another demand they have. Then they want a centralized tracking and management system that functions as a unified portal for all financial transactions regarding transactions taking place on the aggregator's digital platform. And finally, they want a law that binds all the above together, all these 3 points together, so that these provisions are legally enforceable. So to some extent, Rajasthan government has been able to do something for the workers. They have come up with the legislation, and their provisions are quite concrete. In Karnataka, they have offered a accident and life cover of, 5 lakh rupees for gig and platform workers. So they are saying that Telangana, being a fast-growing economy and with the government, so much focused on IT and e-commerce platforms, and so many companies coming and starting their sites here, work sites here, it is important for the government to be proactive and be pro-workers.
And Rahul, could you tell us how the contesting parties have reacted to their demands?
Okay, so for instance, KTR, who is the Minister for IT, Industries and Commerce in Telangana, spoke about this issue around 6 months back. And he spoke in favor of workers. And he said a tripartite board would be set up, and a concrete policy on this would be charted out by the government. But nothing has happened on that front. So president of this union, Sheikh Salahuddin, recently met with the minister. He was told that the policy framework is under construction. It is being developed and halfway through. And once elections are over, it will be ready for implementation. The union also met with Congress leaders, the Congress Manifesto Committee Chairman Sridhar Babu, who has assured them that these points would be raised and would be included in the manifesto. The BJP leaders have also responded positively. Former Minister Mari Shashidhar Reddy told me that they are going to discuss this in the party. Also, Congress and BJP are yet to come up with their election manifesto here. For instance, only Bahujan Samaj Party has mentioned anything about gig and platform workers' welfare, and they have announced 25,000 rupees pension and rupees 5 lakh insurance cover for gig and platform workers. So this is how they have responded.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show is edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. It was written and produced by me, Rahel Philipose, Utsa, Sarmin and Shashank Bhargava. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone who you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.